Welcome, Sophie Strand. It's so great to see you again.
Well, it's lovely to be here with you, Mark. I've long admired your work, and we have so many intersections both in the digital and the real world.
It's true. It's true. I wanted to talk to you about the golden shadow, the part of ourselves that Jung said we suppress in the off limits part of the psyche that actually contains creativity and power and potential. Your work is so concerned with this paradox, death and rebirth, decay and growth. I'd like to know just first, when did that fascination start for you with the paradoxical, the inversion of what we often think of as what strength and power look like?
Hmm. Well, the answer carries a heavy trigger warning. Um, I am a survivor of pre-verbal violent abuse and violent sexual abuse. And so I like to say I was born in hell, and I had to learn how to crawl out of hell, and how to make meaning after I saw things that, in some ways, destroy your sense of morality or fairness or justice. And so you have to decide to make meaning and to make goodness. And for me, the metaphor that has always worked best for me is compost, which is you don't try and get rid of these things you can't digest or properly integrate. You throw them onto the pile with so many other things that eventually they all melt together anarchically to create good soil.
Mm.
And it was later on in my life when I developed a disease that turned out to be an incurable connective tissue genetic disease. And I started to realize that my body was actually going to decay and break down in a way that couldn't easily be reversed or cured. That I realized that the compost heap was an even better metaphor than I had thought it was. And that for me, soil, death, decay is the womb of life. That, Merlin Sheldrake, mycologist and writer, says that we live in the absence left behind by decay. That if nothing broke down, if nothing died, there'd be no room for new life and new experimentation. And so it's a profound generosity that things die, break down, melt together, change, transform, and then provide the mineral nutrient basis for new forests, new ideas. And for me, in my own life, I feel like I've been brought down to the basics so many times in terms of what I believe in, what I can trust, what feels possible, that I'm always trying to make good soil. Um, I'm
Mm.
trying to think about myself not as some heroic individual who will perfect some body or some body of work, but as someone who is decaying and making mistakes generatively in such a way that I might be laying the foundation, the soil foundation for other people to thrive.
Mm, mm. And that's of course what we are all doing. We're all
Yeah.
decaying. We're all
Never great.
walking compost heaps. But
Yeah.
let's go back a little bit. How did you come to the point out of that trauma of deciding to try to alchemize it into something else? It was there a period of not knowing and being stuck with it, or did it come to you spontaneously? This impulse toward growth.
Well, I think that the mind is a very powerful thing, being, organism. Um, and I think I very much compartmentalized as a child. I was lucky to grow up. My parents moved after this happened to the countryside, and I was raised alongside a lot of animals. And I think that at a moment in time when I did not necessarily trust the logic of humanity or adults, I very much trusted other beings. And because I'd been traumatized, I was hypersensitive. We problematize hypersensitivity and trauma responses, but oftentimes they wake us up to the animism of the world. When it's too dangerous to stop noticing everything, suddenly you notice that the trees, the fungi, the salamanders, the worms are also alive. So
Mm,
I would say that this way in which my nervous system was jangled also was paradoxically an opening to communion with the more than human world.
mm,
And I was lucky enough that my parents planted me as someone with trauma, with neurodivergence, in a ecology where there were cats, dogs, plants, dirt, mountains that could mentor me and raise me up. I oftentimes say I was raised by house cats and mountains and puffballs, and it's true. I do think there was a moment later on in my life when I was much older that I realized that I had very serious health issues and had never spoken up about trauma and had never told the truth to the people in my life that mattered about what had happened. And I realized, I read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. I was reading a lot about somatics, and I thought, what if I'm so sick because I haven't moved this psychological uh, baggage in me? And so I think there was a conscious moment where I decided to be vocal about it and to reintegrate it into my creative world and to my writing.
Mhm. Gotcha. Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit more about the creative power of darkness, the creative power of adversity and demons. Rainer Maria Rilke famously didn't want to go through therapy because he said if they get rid of my demons, they might get rid of my angels as well. How do you feel about the idea of exorcising our demons, exorcising darkness in order to heal? And what do we risk losing when we do that?
I think we risk losing everything. I think all of the theology that has been baked into New Age spirituality and also into medicine and New Age and holistic medicine is very much about purity. If you purify yourself, if you lift your vibration, if you think more positive thoughts, you'll heal yourself. And even within medicine itself, if you take enough antibiotics, if you live clean enough, you'll be healthy. Of course, that means that most of us feel sinful, feel like we've failed, feel like we're too dark, we're sludged, we're full of parasites, we haven't integrated the trauma. And so we're always haunted by this body we can't actually financially afford to buy
Mhm.
because all of this costs money. Um,
Mhm.
and it's something that I'm just finished my memoir, which is about healing beyond hope and the human. What does it mean when we want to heal, but not in a way that's about attaining a normative body or a normative nervous system? And something I'll come back to, which I love, is that, the Satan was initially the stumbling block in Judaism. And I love that idea, which is the Satan was not a demon. It was a block in your way that kept you from going in the wrong direction.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think our devils are oftentimes incredibly difficult redirections. And for me, my devils have been two things. They've been moments in my life where I cannot move forward in a certain way that other people seem to be. And it's not easy and it's not fun. It's not something I would gift to other people, but it does cause me to have to collaborate and change and move in more creative ways. So, in a lot of ways, I think it is that block that creates an artistic impulse, a curiosity about how we can collaborate with an immovable object. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
and in another way, I loved always summon Garcia Lorca's Duende, which is I'm dancing at the lip of the wound. I'm not fetishizing some abstract muse. My creative process is much closer to when Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, which is a type of fungi, takes over this ant, this carpenter ant, and drives it, takes over its whole body and drives it to the top of a leaf. And so the ant bites and then sporulates a mushroom out of its head.
Right.
So by the end of that process, is it an ant or a fungus? I mean, the
Mhm.
ant has become the reproductive choreography of the fungus.
Mhm.
And so in a moment of extinction and collapse, I want to invite in the duende, the fungi, that will use me as a mouthpiece in ways that are dangerous and scary and well explode our simplistic value dualisms of easy and bad or good and safe and dangerous. Yeah, I'd like to become a mouthpiece for the more than human duende.
Mm. Well, we're going to get to safety a little bit later in the interview. By the way, did you see the piece in the Times today about the mushroom growing out of the frog?
I think I saw a picture, but I haven't read the article yet. It's ridiculous. I mean, I guess we have more microbial and fungal cells in us than we do human cells. So
Right.
I guess we should be less freaked out by it than we are.
But it put to question, this is a living organism. How can, and fungus grows out of decay. How can it be growing out of a living frog? It was actually quite an interesting piece.
Um,
So I want to ask you about the womb and the invitation. I really love that connection that you make. Talk about womb as darkness, a place of darkness, and how that is an invitation into our lives.
Oh, that's a beautiful question. So I think that for most of history, birth is an incredibly dangerous thing. It's very dangerous right now, actually, for women in America, and that our maternal mortality rates are extremely high, especially for women who are not white and privileged. And so I always say that like the womb is the doorway between death and life. That we never question where we came from, but we're always afraid about where we're going after death. But perhaps they're just embraced by, life is just an orb embraced on either side by something else. And I would say that the womb is a door. It's a dark door. And for me, matter and mother are the same thing. That, the mother as the womb that grows the child, but mother is, it's the root of that word is matter, and matter is soil. It's the very material that builds the earth. That just as we are grown as children in a mother's womb, we are grown in the womb of the dynamic homeostasis of the biosphere, in the dirt itself. Um, there's this wonderful reframe by this philosopher, um, uh, I'm trying to, Emmanuel Cochia, I believe. I don't know if you know him. And he writes in this book, Metamorphosis, that we look at the sky as if it's the future, that we're going to blast off into the sky and into the cosmos. And the stars are galactic, divine destiny. But the truth is that most stars are dead light, that when we're looking at the sky, we're looking at our past, we're looking at a fossil. And the truth
Mm,
is that our future is below us in the soil, that it's the soil that grows the food, the trees, the flowers, the perfumes, the very substance of life. And
mhm,
so for me, the womb is soil. The matter is the mother is the matter. It is that darkness below us that we're afraid of, but is actually the generative part of life.
mhm.
Shit. So we're afraid. I always say that we know that there's blood with birth, but there's also shit with birth, that birth magic is always shit magic. When I say that, people get very upset, but it's true. That
True.
if you've actually been at a birth, you know that it's a shitty, bloody affair, and that life comes in with a lot of impurity. And that's actually how things get born, is when everything kind of melts together. Um, and we live in a culture that's remarkably good at creating waste and then pretending it doesn't exist and offloading it onto cultures that did not produce it. Pollution, our microplastics, our actual physical waste. And it's interestingly enough, I think that the most spiritual thing we can do is learn how to reweave food webs, which is how to take responsibility for our waste. I mean, our trash, I mean, our ideological baggage, our psychological baggage, our actual waste, the fact that our waste often has medicines in it that can disturb ecosystems. And the really, really sensitive thing is say, how can I alchemize my waste such that it can become another being's food, so that it can become the womb that gestates something else? And so for me, that's my spiritual work, is learning how to take responsibility for my darkness and my waste that makes it into a womb, that makes it generative.
Let's talk a little more about how that's done. How do we alchemize our waste? You talk about digesting poison psychologically. Talk a
Well,
little bit about how we do that.
I think that, so I wrote a piece a long time ago called Indigestion is Emergence. And it was all very much about how the genesis of multicellular beings was an act of indigestion. Two early prokaryotic bacteria were extremely hungry, tried to eat each other, and failed. So we are the product of a failed cannibalistic experience. um, and that, in fact, human beings are one of the only animals and organisms on the earth that has learned how to turn everything into calories, to digest everything. So I think that I'm much more attracted to the word of alchemy than I am to digest. I think human beings know how to turn everything into themselves, how to turn grass, minerals, dirt, oil, bears, monkeys, comets, other cultures into themselves. And that is a kind of violence, I think. And I'm more interested in when a nail gets hammered into a tree trunk and the tree grows around it.
Mm.
And interested in the moments where you realize you can't remove something. You can't remove a traumatic event. You can't remove an incurable illness, but you can begin to grow around it and take positions and change the way you hold your body in such a way that you might see different things, feel different things than someone in a normative or healthy body could. So I'm really interested in living with indigestion. And I have severe gastroparesis and I can't eat and I can't digest food. So this is like pretty high stakes and real for me. Like it's theoretical, it's philosophical, but it's also super real, which is how can I begin to collaborate with things that I can't break down, that I can't fully use? How can I let myself be used? Um, and I think that this happens when we can honor things without dissecting them and trying to understand them. That we live in such a Cartesian paradigm that we think that we can only understand things by virtue of breaking them down, opening them up, looking inside, figuring them out. And I'm really interested in letting things live in my body without figuring them out and without vivisecting them and without trying to understand them. Trying to ask the question of how does my body change in relationship to this rather than what is this?
Mm. How would that work, for example, in a human relationship? How would you apply that dynamic to an interpersonal, imperfect, human, limited interpersonal connection? Could you give me some sense?
Absolutely. So I've done a lot of therapy in my life, a lot of different modalities. I've spent so many thousands of dollars on it, so much money on so much therapy. And I think that there's real benefit in self-inquiry and understanding patterns and taking time to pick apart the mystery of your behavior. But I also think that there is something destructive about over analyzing our relationships constantly rather than living them and acting like there's some perfect relationship whereby we all meet each other and we have perfect boundaries. You know, I think that we see this really acted out on social media right now, which is people are not able to respond to each other, not responsible to each other. They don't live in the same town, they're not neighbors, they don't have family in common. And so they can act with this moral code that has no wiggle room, no flexibility. Either you're right or you're wrong. People are never collaborating, curiously investigating other people's belief systems. It's all impact. There's no communication or interplay. And I'm really interested in how do we get family members to talk to each other in a way that isn't about fixing each other. And so for me, it's about having this moment when you're like, I see this person at the grocery store every single day. And maybe we have a lot of differences. And I am not ever going to change their mind or fix them. And we are never going to communicate in exactly the right way. But can we begin to figure out if there's an interface, an ecotone, a place where we can talk to each other at the edges of our different ecologies? And I think a great way of doing this is with our family and our parents. It's so easy to infantilize ourselves and say that we are the victim of our parents' faults. And that it was usually, I would say in Freud, in typical psychology, the mom gets most of the brunt. And in fact, one of the things I've seen that's really interesting is a lot of women my age go to therapy and they are told that it was their mother's fault. And then the one person who is usually admittedly difficult, but also has their back, they're isolated from. They're told to build boundaries, and suddenly they're completely isolated. And I'm curious about how that actually is helpful. What would it look like to say, this person is so difficult? We're all difficult. We all have so much pain. How can we create a common tongue?
A common tongue. What do you mean by an ecotone?
So an ecotone is one of my favorite. I always use ecological examples because I figured we are ecologies, living in ecologies. We should actually use them. So an ecotone is the place where one ecology very, very dramatically shifts into another. So it's like a living hedge or boundary. So it's the shore. The shore is an interface. It's not like a thickness. It's what you can, it's the interface of the sand, the land meeting the sea. Hedges where a field and a forest meet are often called an ecotone. Usually, interestingly enough, they are the most biodiverse. They're the place where there's the most exploration and different species, different interactions between species. They're incredibly fertile. They also act as a semi-porous boundary so that some species can go in one direction, some can't, and vice versa. And for me, ecotone is a word that comes from eco, which is Greek for household, and tonos, which is Greek for tension. It's a place where tensions are held and not dissolved. It's a place where the generativity is created by holding tension rather than trying to fix it. And so
Mm.
I think it's a wonderful example of how we can begin to hold tensions generatively rather than constantly problematizing and trying to fix them.
Mhm. Beautiful. That's really beautiful. And that brings us to the question of safety,
Mhm.
and the way that we are always striving for security. You've said that becoming new and never safe is the answer. And you've also questioned whether safety is a worthy goal. It's so counterintuitive. Can you just say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about those early bacteria that I mentioned, is the basis of all multicellular life a safe beginning. If we think of any being on this planet, it began as a mistake, as a glitch, that then accidentally was perfectly adapted to an ecosystem.
Hmm.
Everything about us, by virtue of how evolution works, how it slowly unravels and fits into each other, was initially a very risky mistake. And so surviving is about risking being wrong. And that's a very, very dangerous thing to do. But if we always stay the same, we are never adapting alongside our changing climates and ecosystems.
Hmm.
So to survive is to risk doing something that might not work. That symbiosis, we're learning more and more that this very classical neo-Darwinian idea of linear evolution is not actually how most biological novelty is created. It's through moments of anarchic mergers,
Hmm.
through a transversal intimacy when species blend together. They burn the bridge to their old body and fuse bodies symbiotically. And I can't imagine sharing a body with another being and knowing that you'll never return to your old self is a particularly safe, pleasurable, or fun experience. It takes, I would think it takes an extraordinary amount of somatic bravery to do
Hmm.
that. And
Hmm.
I think that right now we are facing societal collapse. We're facing the breakdown of our governments, our ecosystems, our communication. And I think that if we're going to learn how to collaborate and with each other, we're going to have to risk not being safe. Being safe oftentimes means being with people you can predict and expect. But that means we're not evolving. And I think that we have to, the people who are, sometimes we have to be safe. Sometimes we're too sick, we're too tired, and we need to pull back. So there's a time for everything. There's a season for everything. But for some of us who have the strength psychologically or physically, it might be important to start to think with other people, think with other species, and think with other paradigms symbiotically.
Hmm. And of course, that goes against what we're learning from cancel culture and people who are so afraid of being opposed and being exposed to, triggering kinds of emotions. What's the middle path there, do you think, between respecting, obviously the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of certain groups, and not aspiring to a false security, a kind of false safety that, as you said, prevents us from evolving?
So it's a really good question. I think right now something I always think about this collection of Hannah Arendt's work that I read at Bard College, and she's buried there. So we have a big commitment to her work at Bard College. And I always remember reading that she was very worried that people were all have had a homogenized morality And when everyone shares this kind of universal morality, no one actually has a morality. And no one has a moral center or code of ethics. And that you can shift out socialism for fascism overnight. And if everyone shares it, no one will notice. Because everyone will just say, I'm doing exactly what the other person is doing. And what I'm very interested in right now is what she said is everyone creating their own personal conduct. And that everything you do has to come from some deep sense of what you personally think is right and wrong. And I think that all I can say to people is I hope that we can get quiet enough that we can all get in touch with that deep inner moral compass that isn't cultural, isn't universal, isn't on someone else's Instagram page, but tells us what it means to interact with people lovingly. Interacting with people lovingly doesn't mean being safe or not triggering them, but it means caring about them, caring about how they feel and how they'll walk away from the experience. And I think that that comes not from some heuristics, not some list of how to act, but from some deep internal sense of how would I like to be treated? What do I care about? What does it mean to care about another person?
So when you talk about care, I feel like there are two different levels of care.
Yeah.
There's sentimental care, which is I'm going to dance around all of your insecurities. And then there's caring about the truth and wanting to be in truth with another person. That feels like a fine line that is quickly disappearing, in this polarized, moralistic moment. How can we care in the capital C, care about the truth, while also caring for the wounded individual? I don't know that that's an answerable question, but I'd be interested in what you had to say.
You know, um, there's a dialogue happening, and I'm forgetting the person who perhaps said it, but I know that it's come up in conversations with my friend Louise Mojica, who is a somatic educator and has a pretty big online presence, which is that um, we think we have to educate everyone. We think it is our personal responsibility to bring everyone into the truth, into our truth.
Mm,
But that's actually a very colonial impulse.
mm,
And you have to ask, I think something I've been asking myself lately is, has this person asked for me to care about them and asked me to educate them?
mm,
And have I been given consent to enter into their space and teach them and
mm.
tell them how they're wrong and tell them how they could change and care about them in some kind of way? And I think that lately I've been trying to be okay with letting people go and turning towards other people and saying there are people who are going to talk to you in the right way, who care about you in a way that works for you. We are not a match. And I don't need to struggle against that. And I don't need to insert myself into your space aggressively. I can move somewhere else. And so I do think we have to ask ourselves if educating everyone is perhaps a kind of rearticulation of the very colonial impulse it's pretending to interrupt.
That's so interesting. So let's switch a little to disability. You've said that disability is an invitation to relationality.
Yeah.
It's like such a deep and beautiful point. Could you tell me more about what you mean?
Yeah. I mean, so the first example I'll use is an ecological one, which is that 450 million years ago, plants made it onto dry land, except they were not the plants we know. They had no roots. They looked like tumbleweeds or little puddles of algae, and they couldn't access the nutrients of an ecosystem of the soil that could hardly function. And mycorrhizal fungi, which are those filamentous fungi that live in the soil and connect forests, reached up and taught plants how to have roots. And they acted for millions of years as a surrogate root system, plugging plants into place, into community, and into nutrients and into water. And still to this day, 99% of plants depend primarily on these associations. And so for me, the beautiful part of that example is that when we can't do something, when we have a lack, when we don't have roots, or we can't eat the sun, or we can't access water, it's an opening that it's an invitation, an open door to collaborate with another being who we might not necessarily collaborate with if we were healthy or whole or totally fine. And so for me, when we are disabled, when we are sick, when we can't take care of ourselves, it is an invitation to collaborate with other people, with other root systems, with
Mhm.
other fungi, with other beings, with other medicines and modalities that we might never have interacted with had we been okay. And I like to sometimes tell people who are sick, who come to talk with me, that a sick person is like like a part of a mycorrhizal system that draws in all these nodes of connectivity, that they become the locus of community, that they draw in people and caretakers and medicines and teams, and suddenly you become a celebration, you know? And I think that in a culture that lionizes the atomized individual, the disabled person offers this other tact, which is that I don't have to be perfect at everything. I don't necessarily have to get better. Like, what is better? What is whole? But I do need to depend on other people, and that can be a joyful, beautiful thing where everyone is benefiting.
Mm. Is that ever a challenge for you, the dependency, asking
Oh,
for
yeah,
help?
absolutely. All the time. I mean, part of the reason why I try and create these new frames is because I struggle so much. And because the culture is always banging us over the head, telling us that we must be rugged individuals, we have to stop being so codependent, we have to, uh, individuate from our parents. We're always having to draw these lines and prove that we are productive members of capitalistic society, that we are good workers, that we'll enter back into the workforce. Um, and I think that it's so easy to always feel like a failure when you're sick, especially when you have an illness that doesn't have an easy timeline of getting better, that doesn't have a cure. Maybe you have had a disability your whole life and it doesn't even feel like a disability. It's just how you were born, and people are somehow telling you that's wrong. And I think for me, what I'm always struggling to do is to be more generous with myself and my own feelings of failure in a way that possibly I could give to other people.
Mm, mm. And what's the connection between debility, limitation, imperfection, and originality, do you think, as an artist and as a thinker?
I mean, I go back to there's a wonderful quote from a paleontologist, Thomas Halliday. And I actually am using it as the epigraph for my upcoming science fiction fantasy novel. And it is nature forswears nostalgia.
Oh, I love that.
And it means what it's part of a much longer chapter in a book he wrote about deep time. And what he is explaining is that nature is creative, not nostalgic. It wants more life, not more of the same life. And that means glitching.
Mm,
Evolution is built on mistakes, mistakes that somehow become useful. It's a cascade of accumulating mistakes that are suddenly creatively interesting to an assembled ecology. We all began as mistakes, and we will only survive if we continue to fail generatively.
mm, beautiful. Let's talk a little bit about the cultural shadow and the ways that we're denying so many things that actually have potential for wisdom and growth. You say to tell the right stories now might be agonizing. Let's talk about what the right stories are and
Can you give me the context? Where did I say that? It's one of those moments where you're like, hmm.
I think you said it in an interview.
Mhm. I do think about how human supremacist culture pretends that the world is not alive. I actually think that takes a lot of hard work.
Mm,
If we look at most other sustainable cultures for most of human history, they've had some sort of animistic impulse,
mm,
some sort of understanding that everything is alive and matters and has an opinion, and maybe we shouldn't discount that. So this is a new phenomenon, this idea, this material reductionist paradigm that puts a very young species on the top of the like hierarchy is a very strange and new thing. And I like to think of a foot that has gone to sleep. You sleep on your hand wrong, or you sit down and you sit on your foot. And when it comes back to life, when you're coming back into being able to use your hand or your foot, it prickles and stings. It
mm,
hurts.
Mm,
And I think that right now, a lot of people are waking up to the fact that we have been shooting an arrow and the arrow has been curving back into our own breast. That every time that we hurt our environment, we're hurting ourselves. Um, and I think that waking up to the aliveness of the world right now is agonizing. It's physically painful. That the threshold we have to step over as we come back into awareness that we have been hurting our extended bodies and minds and relationships is one of physical and psychological anguish. And I oftentimes think that we need to help midwife each other through these experiences. We're all going to go through them at different time periods and different paces.
mm, mm,
And so I think what I was saying with telling the right stories might be agonizing is as we come back into dialogue with our polluted, upset ecosystems,
mm,
we are going to start hearing screams that we've muted for a really long time. And that is going to be painful and
mm,
hard, really hard to stay with that. And I think that the only way we can stay with it and not run away from it is together and is through community.
mm. And so, how does that dynamic apply to personal awakening and personal evolution? Telling ourselves the right stories might be agonizing, right? So, we have to go through that period of prickling and hurting as the numb parts come back to life. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think very personally, it was one of the ways I dealt with trauma was disassociation. And it meant that I was not in my body. And it meant that I was really good at physical feats and making bad decisions and being impulsive and crazy. And actually, I was pretty well rewarded culturally by my disassociation. It actually made for a pretty functional person, but it was harmful to me physically. And I think that when I decided to start feeling with my whole body again and started to look directly at the violence I had been through and to look at how I had hurt myself trying to escape it, it was painful to see the ways I had contorted myself. It was agonizing to start telling the truth. It
Mm,
felt scary to admit that I had been cowardly about it for so long, personally, that
mhm,
I had tried to avoid this, avoid my body, avoid my history, avoid my nervous system. And
mhm,
so I'm so happy to be here feeling with my whole body today.
mhm,
There were periods of my life where I like was a balloon floating above a person. I was
mhm,
so disassociated, I was hardly in my body. And I
mhm,
am here fully today. I can smell everything, see everything. I can feel with so much more vibrancy. But getting to that point meant telling stories, confronting stories that I really had wanted to avoid for a long time.
mhm. And that goes directly to the theme of the golden shadow and understanding that without going through that darkness, that testing,
Yeah.
of adversity, we can't really embody ourselves fully. And the paradoxes of ourselves. When we avoid the unsafety of what a mess things are and what a compost heap we are, we
Yeah.
we also avoid our own aliveness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
we are paradoxes that can never be sanded down. And I think that's what I'm coming to more and more, which is I think I am a person. When people say how has life been recently, I always say it's been extremely both. And what I mean is that there's been so much joy and goodness, and there's been really hard things. And it's the string that's strung between them so tightly that it can vibrate that makes a type of music that is the paradox of my life, you know?
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, I can't wait to read your memoir. If you're capturing this in your memoir, I
Try to.
can't wait to read it. And I just want to ask you one last question. You have one of my favorite things that I've read of yours is when you say that death is the moment when solitary aliveness overflows its cup.
Yeah.
Death is the moment when solitary aliveness overflows its cup. What do you mean?
So I came to this personal realization when I was younger and I was sitting with this deer that had been hit by a car and it died in my parents' backyard. And it was really, really hot midsummer. And I watched as this deer decayed really fast. And it didn't become less. It actually became more life. It became went from being a body to being a teeming ecosystem of maggots and flies and fungi and vultures and birds and so many different beings. And for me, I was like, oh, it's the moment when it's not just me as an individual. I become an ecosystem where many individuals can live. And so for me, that we are briefly a skin silhouette for matter that is on a journey, that we are a doorway for matter. And that at a certain point, that matter keeps moving. And it doesn't mean the aliveness is done, it just overflows. This brief silhouette, this brief shape that it holds.
Mm. Sophie, it's just been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so, so much. When I talk to you, I can feel my mind expanding, and that's always a good thing.
Well, thank you for asking such thoughtful questions. Yeah, they've forced me to go deeper today than I would have gone. Thank you.
I'm happy. Thank you so much, my dear.
Thank you.
Feel good. Bye.
Thank you, Mark.